Story number 1. The cabin that knew my name. I should have turned back the moment I saw my name carved into the frozen wood of the front door. But I was too tired, too cold, and too eager to settle in for the night. The snowfall had been relentless, burying the winding mountain road behind me, making retreat impossible. My fingers were numb as I reached for the rusted key the host had left in a small tin box by the entrance. The moment I turned it in the lock, the door creaked open on its own. The cabin smelled of old wood and something damp, like melted snow, trapped in the floorboards for years. A fireplace sat in the center, unlit but prepped with neatly stacked logs. A single lamp flickered dimly beside a worn-out armchair. It was quaint, just as the listing had promised, yet something about it felt too familiar, as if I had been here before, but that was impossible. I had booked the place last minute, choosing it at random after my first Airbnb canceled due to the storm. I dropped my bag in the small bedroom and stepped back into the living area. That's when I saw it, a journal sitting open on the coffee table. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but I could still read the words clearly. The handwriting was eerily similar to mine. And the date? Today's date. Arrived at the cabin just before nightfall. The snow is heavy. It's quiet here, but I feel watched. A chill ran down my spine. This had to be a prank. Maybe the owner liked to play tricks on guests, or maybe another visitor had left it behind. I forced a laugh, closed the book, and tossed it onto the shelf. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I turned to lock the door, but something stopped me. The lock was already bolted from the inside. That didn't make sense. I had just walked in. The thought unsettled me, but I shook it off. Maybe it had jammed on its own. Maybe the cold was getting to me. I built a fire, made some tea, and wrapped myself in the thickest blanket I could find. The warmth helped, but the unease lingered. My eyes kept drifting to the journal, half hidden between books on the shelf. I told myself not to open it again. I told myself it didn't matter. But as the night deepened, I found myself reaching for it, unable to resist. The next entry was written in shaking letters. The house knows I'm here. It speaks in the creak of the floorboards, in the sigh of the wind through the cracks. I am not alone. I shut the book, my pulse hammering. That was enough. I needed sleep. I forced myself into bed, burying under layers of blankets, listening to the fire crackle in the other room. The wind outside had softened into a whisper, but it wasn't comforting. It sounded like murmuring. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself that until I drifted into a restless sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of movement in the cabin. Not the wind, not the fire, something shifting. I held my breath, straining to listen. The floorboards groaned softly, deliberately, like footsteps. But I was alone. I reached for my phone to check the time. 3:12 a.m. The screen flickered before the battery icon flashed empty. I had charged it before bed. It shouldn't have been dead. The air in the room felt heavier, thick with something unseen. That's when I heard it. A whisper right beside my ear. You came back. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribs. The room was empty. Nothing but my own ragged breathing filled the silence. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the lamp. But the bulb flickered and died the second I touched it. I needed to leave. I stumbled into the living room, ready to grab my keys and get the hell out. But my keys weren't on the table where I left them. The fire had burned low, casting shadows that twisted along the walls. and then my eyes landed on the journal. It was open again. The pages were flipping on their own, slow and deliberate, as if unseen fingers were turning them. My breath hitched when they stopped. The ink was fresh this time, wet, the letters forming as I watched. "Don't run. You always try to run." I staggered back, my entire body ice cold despite the lingering embers in the fireplace. My name appeared next, scrawled in frantic loops across the bottom of the page, over and over and over. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned, barely able to breathe. The bedroom door was open, swinging gently, as if someone had just walked out. But I had left it closed. I had locked it. A whisper crawled through the room, threading through the walls, the wood, the very air I was breathing. "You left me here." But I never left. The fire sputtered out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the window, moonlight reflecting off the snow, illuminating the porch outside. And that's when I saw them. Footprints, not leading up to the cabin, leading away, and they were mine. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my bag, threw on my coat, and reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I yanked, it stayed shut, like something was holding it closed from the other side. The journal slid from the table, landing at my feet with a final entry written in bold, dripping ink. "Stay. You never left before." A sound rumbled from the bedroom, a scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. I backed away, my body trembling. The closet door was cracked open now. I could feel something watching from the darkness inside. The wind picked up again, whispering through the gaps in the walls. Only now I realized it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, and it was saying my name. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to escape, to do anything but stand there frozen. Then the whisper came again, closer. "Come back to me." I don't remember much after that. Only that somehow, the next morning, I woke up in my car, parked on an empty stretch of road miles from the cabin. My keys were in the ignition. My bag sat in the passenger seat. My phone was fully charged. The cabin was gone. Not abandoned. Not burned down. Gone. As if it had never been there. I checked my phone, scrolled through my messages, my emails, my Airbnb reservation, but there was nothing. No confirmation. No proof I had ever booked the place. The listing was gone. The host number wasn't in my call log, but the journal was in my bag. And on the last page, beneath my name written over and over, was a new entry. The ink still drying. "See you next winter." Story number 2. The guest who never left. The first night I woke up to the sound of footsteps overhead. Slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the ceiling to the other. My breath caught in my throat. The listing had been clear. This was a single-level cabin. No upstairs, no attic. I lay still, staring at the dark wooden beams above me. The sound stopped. The air inside the room felt heavier than before, like something unseen was pressing down on me. I tried to convince myself it was the wind shifting the old wooden planks, but then the floor creaked again. This time, directly above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for it to happen again. A long, slow, dragging sound followed, like someone pulling something heavy across the ceiling. That was the moment I knew I was not alone. The Airbnb had seemed perfect online, a cozy, snow-covered retreat deep in the mountains. The host, a quiet older man named Walter, had met me at the door with a warm smile and a warning. "You won't have any neighbors this time of year," he had said, handing me the keys. Just you and the silence. Peaceful, isn't it? It had seemed peaceful at first. The fireplace crackled warmly. The storm outside had been beautiful rather than menacing, and the isolation felt like exactly what I needed. But peaceful places aren't supposed to have footsteps above your head in the middle of the night. The next morning, I forced myself to check the ceiling. It was solid wood. No hatch, no seams, nothing to suggest there was a space up there. Yet the noise had been real. I couldn't have imagined it. I texted Walter, trying to keep my message casual. Hey, quick question. There aren't any animals in the ceiling, right? Heard some noises last night. His reply was instant. Number, the place is sealed tight. Shouldn't be anything up there. I stared at the message. It felt too confident, too quick, like he had been expecting me to ask. The day passed in uneasy silence. Snow piled up against the windows, the storm intensifying. By evening, the roads were buried. Even if I wanted to leave, I wouldn't make it far. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checked them twice, then settled into bed. The fire had burned down to embers. The cabin was silent, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the footsteps started again. They were heavier this time, slow and steady, pacing above me. I sat up, barely breathing. The ceiling groaned under an unseen weight. My phone was already in my hand, my fingers hovering over the flashlight button, and then a single loud thump shook the entire cabin. It came from the front porch. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. Step by step, I crept toward the door, careful to avoid the old creaky floorboards. The peephole was fogged over, but I could make out a shape just beyond the porch railing. A person, standing completely still in the snow, facing the cabin. My stomach turned to ice. I hadn't heard anyone approach. There were no footprints leading up to the porch, just endless, untouched snow stretching into the darkness. I flicked the porch light on. No one was there. The footsteps above me stopped. At the exact same moment, I slammed the deadbolt shut, stepped away from the door, and grabbed my phone. Walter's number was still open on my screen. My fingers were shaking too hard to type, so I called instead. The line rang once, twice. Then a click, no voice, just breathing. Deep, slow, not mine. I hung up immediately. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. The fire had nearly died out, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, creeping toward me. I backed into the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the bed, trying to convince myself this was all in my head, that the cold and isolation were messing with me. And then my phone vibrated. A new message from Walter. Don't open the door, not even if it knocks. My heart stopped. I stared at the message, the room spinning around me. My breathing was too loud, too fast. Then came the knock. Soft at first, 3 gentle taps against the wooden door. Not the front door, the bedroom door. The air turned, ice cold. I clutched my phone, my fingers numb against the screen. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen in place. The knock came again, 3 slow taps. Closer this time, like whatever was on the other side had pressed its face against the wood. I squeezed my eyes shut. This wasn't happening. It wasn't real. A whisper drifted through the crack beneath the door. Let me in. It's cold. I lunged for the lamp and flicked it on. The knocking stopped. The cabin was silent again. I didn't sleep. I sat awake, clutching my phone, my back pressed against the wall. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I waited for the sun to rise. Morning came slow. Pale light filtered through the frosted windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I didn't move until the clock read 8 a.m. I forced myself to open the bedroom door. The cabin was exactly as I left it, except for the front door. It was wide open. Snow had piled inside, covering the welcome mat. The footprints I had seen the night before were still there, still leading away from the cabin. But now, there were more of them. A second set, smaller, leading inside. I grabbed my bag and ran. The snow had let up enough for me to push through the knee-deep drifts, struggling toward my car. I didn't dare look back. I didn't care if my tires spun, if I had to drive with frozen fingers, if the ice on the windshield blurred my vision. I just had to get away. An hour later, I pulled into the first gas station I could find. My hands were still shaking as I ordered coffee, barely hearing the cashier when she asked if I was okay. I nodded numbly, staring out the window at the snow-covered road. Then, without thinking, I pulled out my phone and opened the Airbnb app. The listing was gone. Not canceled, not unavailable, just gone. No record of my booking. No messages from Walter. No proof I had ever been there at all. My stomach twisted as I scrolled frantically through my call log. Walter's number was missing. So was the message he had sent me last night. I must have sat there for a full minute just staring at my screen. Then slowly my fingers typed a single question into Google. Walter's cabin Airbnb, missing person. The first result made my blood turn to ice. Local man's disappearance, still unsolved. Airbnb host, vanished from his mountain home 10 years ago. Investigators believe he may have died in the winter storm that swept through the region in 2014. No remains were ever found. I dropped my phone. The reflection in the gas station window flickered for just a second, and behind me, something whispered my name. Story number 3. The basement. I wasn't supposed to enter. I should have listened to the warning. It was right there in the listing. Basement off limits. Simple, clear, and easy to follow. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and by the time I realized that, it was already too late. The cabin was buried deep in the woods, surrounded by snow so thick that the road had nearly disappeared by the time I arrived. It was the kind of isolation I had been craving. No traffic, no noise, just me and the silence. The host had left the key in a lockbox by the door, along with a short note. Welcome. Make yourself at home. Please don't enter the basement. The place was cozy, small, but warm, with an old stone fireplace crackling in the corner. The furniture was simple, the walls lined with bookshelves filled with dusty old novels, and the windows were frosted over from the cold outside. Everything about the cabin felt untouched, like it had been frozen in time. The first night was quiet, peaceful even. The only sounds were the wind howling through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden beams settling. But then, in the dead of night, I heard it, a noise from beneath me. It started as a faint shuffling, like something moving against the floorboards. I told myself it was probably mice. Old cabins always had pests, right? I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head. But then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from below the floor. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Just silence. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had shifted something outside. But when I finally drifted back to sleep, the knocking came again. This time closer. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just the house settling. That's what people say when they don't want to admit they're scared. I made coffee, sat by the fire, and tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. But my eyes kept drifting to the far end of the cabin, where a door stood slightly ajar. The basement. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived. The door was old, its wood warped with age, and an old iron latch held it shut. I knew I shouldn't, but something about it pulled at me, like a thread unraveling. Just a peek, I told myself, just enough to see what was down there. I unlatched the door. The second I did, a gust of cold air rushed up from the darkness below. It wasn't just cold, it was damp, heavy, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something metallic. My stomach twisted, and for a moment, I thought about closing the door and walking away. Then I saw them, footprints in the dust. They weren't old. The dust was thick, untouched except for a clear set of footprints leading down the wooden steps. And they weren't mine. I should have closed the door. I should have locked it and never looked back. But instead, I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned beneath my weight, the sound swallowed by the heavy air. The light barely cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but cold, stone walls and a floor covered in dirt. The footprints led deeper, disappearing into the shadows. I followed them, each step slow and careful. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun, my heart slamming against my ribs. My flashlight flickered as the basement plunged into suffocating darkness. I rushed back up the stairs, grabbing at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, my breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine. It was faint at first, a slow, raspy inhale from somewhere in the darkness behind me. My skin prickled as I turned, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The footprints, they weren't leading deeper in. They were leading out. Something had been down here, and it had left. The breathing grew louder, closer, until I felt the warmth of it against my neck. I bolted, kicking at the door, slamming my fists against it, screaming. Walls pressed in around me, the air growing thick with something that wasn't quite smoke, but burned my throat all the same. And then, just as suddenly as it had shut, the door swung open. I stumbled forward, gasping as I fell into the living room. The fire had gone out, the room freezing cold. I slammed the basement door shut, throwing the latch back into place. My breath came in ragged gulps as I pressed my back against the wall, staring at the door like it might burst open at any moment. For a long time, nothing happened. The cabin was silent again. The only sound was the wind rattling the windows, the storm outside still raging. I told myself, I imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me. Then I saw them, the footprints, not leading to the basement this time, leading from it, across the wooden floor, up to the couch, past the fireplace, stopping right in front of the chair where I'd been sitting just minutes before. The realization hit me like ice water. Something had been here, watching me. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't stop to pack, didn't stop to check my phone. I just threw open the front door and stepped into the blinding snow. The cold bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. I stumbled through the snow, my car barely visible through the thick drifts. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally yanking the door open. The moment I slid into the driver's seat, I hit the lock button, and then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure standing on the porch, motionless, silent, watching. I couldn't see its face, couldn't tell if it was a person or something else. But I knew, with every part of me, that it wasn't Walter. I turned the key. The engine sputtered to life, tires spinning in the deep snow as I slammed my foot on the gas. The figure didn't move, not even as I sped away, leaving the cabin and everything inside it behind. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun had started to rise, casting pale light over the frozen streets. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling as I reached for my phone. I opened the Airbnb app, scrolling through my reservations, but the listing was gone. No record of the cabin, no messages from Walter, nothing. I tried searching online, looking for any mention of the place. That's when I found it, an article, old, nearly forgotten, buried beneath years of news. The headline sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Local cabin burned down in 1994. Owner found dead in basement. Story number 4. The disappearing cabin. The cabin was gone. I stood there, my boots buried in the deep snow, my breath hanging in the frozen air. I had only stepped outside for a moment to grab more firewood, to clear my head. But now, the cabin was just missing. The space where it had stood was nothing but untouched snow, stretching endlessly into the dark forest. No walls, no roof, no sign that it had ever existed. My footprints were still there, leading from where I stood. But they ended abruptly, right where the front door had been. I took a step forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. The ground beneath me was firm, undisturbed, like it had never been walked on before. I turned in frantic circles, scanning the tree line, my breath coming fast and sharp. The snowfall had thickened, swallowing the sky in a suffocating white haze. I had just been inside. I had just been by the fire. How could it be gone? Panic clawed up my throat. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers stiff from the cold. No signal. Of course, the Airbnb listing had warned about that. Remote location. No service, no Wi-Fi, complete solitude. I hadn't cared when I booked it. I had wanted solitude. Now, I wasn't so sure. I forced myself to retrace my steps, my boots sinking into the deep snow. Maybe I had turned the wrong way. Maybe the storm had disoriented me. But the more I walked, the more I realized there was nothing here. No sign of disturbed snow, no foundation, no footprints other than my own. I should have never come here. The first sign that something was wrong had been subtle. When I arrived, the cabin had felt off. Not in the way that old places sometimes do, not like bad energy or a strange smell, but like it wasn't really there. The listing had seemed normal enough. Rustic winter retreat, isolated but cozy. Pictures had shown a charming wooden cabin surrounded by snow-draped pines, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, like the walls weren't solid, like the air was thinner, stretched too tight around me. The fireplace had been lit, though the host had promised no one else would be there. The bed was made, the kettle warm on the stove. It was as if someone had been expecting me. That night, I barely slept. The storm outside howled through the trees, but the real unease came from the silence inside the cabin. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but watchful. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to something scratching against the window. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not like tree branches, not like the wind, like fingernails. I hadn't dared to look. Instead, I had buried myself under the blankets, telling myself it was nothing, that the storm was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Now standing in the middle of an empty, snow-covered void, I felt that same presence pressing against me, the weight of unseen eyes. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone behind me. Nothing. Just the wind, lifting swirls of snow into the air. My breathing came fast, uneven. I had to get out of here. The car. It was parked just beyond the trees. If I could make it there, I could drive to the nearest town. Get help. I started moving, forcing my legs to push through the heavy snow. The wind fought me with every step, the cold biting into my exposed skin. Then I saw them. Footprints, not mine. A single trail, leading away from where the cabin had been. They were deep, deliberate, the stride too long for a person walking at a normal pace. Like something had run. A new kind of fear settled into my bones. I followed them. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. Something in my gut told me that if I turned back now, if I ignored whatever was leading me forward, I wouldn't make it out of these woods. The prints weaved through the trees, moving in a straight line, purposeful. I stumbled after them, the snow blurring my vision, the wind howling louder like a voice trying to speak through the storm. Then the footprints stopped, right in front of a door. Not a building, not a cabin, just a door. Standing alone in the snow. It was old, warped by time, the paint peeling away in long splintered strips. A brass handle gleamed dully in the dim light. There were no walls, no frame, no foundation, just a door standing upright in the middle of nowhere. And I knew, without understanding how, that this was my cabin. I reached for the handle. My fingers barely brushed against the metal when the door swung open on its own. Beyond it wasn't the forest. It wasn't the snow. It was the cabin. The fire still burned in the hearth. My bag sat untouched beside the couch. The cup of tea I had made earlier still steamed on the table, as if no time had passed at all. I stepped through. The moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me. The wind stopped. The cold vanished. I stood there, frozen, my breath shaking as I turned back. The door was gone. Nothing but the log walls of the cabin. I rushed to the window, my pulse hammering in my skull. Outside, the storm still raged, the trees bending under the force of the wind. But something was different. The footprints in the snow. They weren't outside anymore. They were inside, leading from the front door, across the floor, stopping right behind me. A whisper brushed against my ear. "You left last time." My body locked in place. My throat tightened, my fingers digging into my palms. Slowly, I turned to face the empty room behind me, except it wasn't empty. Something stood in the corner, a shadow where there should be none. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. The fire crackled softly. The room was warm, but I was colder than I had ever been in my life. Then, in the dim firelight, I saw it. A second cup of tea sitting across from mine, steam still rising. I was never alone in this cabin. I never had been. And this time I knew I wouldn't be leaving. Story number 5, the wrong reflection. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was just tired. I had driven through the snowstorm for hours, barely able to see the road, through the thick, endless white. By the time I reached the cabin, my body ached from exhaustion, my eyes heavy with fatigue. The cabin was small, tucked deep in the woods, its roof heavy with snow. The wind howled through the trees, and I felt the cold settle into my bones as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was warm, too warm, as if someone had just been there. The fire was already burning in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. A musty scent filled the air, mixed with something faintly metallic. I ignored it, too tired to care. I set my bag down and turned toward the hallway. where an old full-length mirror stood against the wall. Its glass was cloudy, its frame warped with age. Something about it made my skin prickle. I told myself it was just the lighting, the exhaustion, but still, something felt off. I took a step closer, studying my reflection. My face was pale, my dark hoodie pulled tight around my body. My reflection did the same. But then just as I turned away, I saw it. The delay. My reflection stood still for a fraction of a second too long, before finally moving. A chill crawled up my spine. I told myself I was imagining things. The glass was old, warped. Maybe there was some kind of distortion. But as I stared into the mirror, a deep unease settled in my chest. The snowstorm outside thickened, hammering against the cabin with a violent force. I pulled the curtain shut and tried to shake off the creeping sense of wrongness. I just needed sleep. That night, I dreamed of the mirror. I dreamed I was standing in front of it, staring at my reflection. My face was hollow, my skin unnaturally pale. But in the dream, I wasn't the one in control. My reflection tilted its head at an unnatural angle. Its lips parted, stretching too wide. I tried to move, to step away, but my reflection didn't. It stayed still. And then it smiled. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs. The room was dark. The fire in the hearth, nothing but glowing embers. The storm outside had calmed to a whisper. I forced myself to breathe, to shake off the dream. But something felt different. The air in the cabin was heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway. The mirror was facing my bed. I hadn't moved it. A slow, crawling horror spread through me. I sat up, gripping the blankets and shaking fists. The glass was dark, reflecting nothing but shadow. But then, as I stared, I saw it. A shape shifting in the darkness. Not me. Something else. I didn't move. I couldn't. My pulse pounded in my ears as the shape grew sharper, clearer. It was me. But it wasn't. The reflection lifted its hand before I did. My stomach lurched. A scream clawed at my throat, but I was frozen, trapped in place as the figure inside the glass slowly stepped forward. I scrambled out of bed, knocking over the lamp in my panic. The reflection didn't mimic me anymore. It stood still, its head tilting ever so slightly, watching. I lunged for my bag, my fingers fumbling for my keys. I needed to leave. Now I grabbed my coat, yanking open the door, only to be met with a wall of snow. The storm had buried the cabin completely, trapping me inside. A soft creak echoed through the cabin. I turned slowly. The reflection was gone, but I wasn't alone. A whisper brushed against my ear. "You took too long." The air turned ice cold. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The mirror stood empty now, just a hollow, dark frame. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I stepped forward cautiously, my hands shaking. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Then, from behind me, a breath. I spun, expecting to see someone standing there, but the cabin was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and my reflection was back, but it wasn't copying me. It stood there, grinning. Not a normal smile, not mine. Its lips stretched too far, revealing teeth that weren't mine. Its eyes were wrong, empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the dim light of the cabin. My breath hitched in my throat as it slowly raised its hand. My hands were at my sides. I wasn't moving, but it was. It pressed its palm against the inside of the glass, and then it stepped forward. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, my heart slamming against my ribs. The mirror rippled like water, distorting as the figure pushed through. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. But the door was still blocked, the windows sealed by thick ice. The fire flickered wildly, throwing erratic shadows across the walls. And then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. Slow, deliberate steps moving toward me. I turned just in time to see it step out of the mirror completely. It stood there, stretching its limbs like it had been trapped for a long, long time. Then it lifted its head, those black eyes locking onto mine. Your turn. The lights flickered, my vision blurred. A cold, sinking feeling pulled at my chest. And then everything shifted. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the mirror, trapped. I pounded against the glass, screaming, but no sound came out. On the other side, the thing wearing my face smiled. It pulled on my coat, picked up my bag, and turned toward the door. It wasn't trapped anymore. I was. The last thing I saw before it stepped outside was my own reflection, staring back at me, still grinning. Story number 6. The Man in the Snow. The first time I saw him, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The snow had been falling in thick, heavy sheets, blurring the trees beyond the cabin. I had been unpacking, settling in for a week of solitude when I glanced out of the window and saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest. He was far away, barely visible through the swirling white, but I could tell he was facing the cabin, just standing there, not moving, not reacting to the brutal wind that whipped through the trees. I told myself it was nothing. A hunter maybe, a lost hiker, someone passing through. But something about the way he stood so perfectly still made my stomach twist. I turned away, shook off the unease, and forced myself to ignore it. But when I looked again, he was closer. The storm had thickened, but I could see him more clearly now. His clothes were dark, too thin for this kind of weather. No coat, no gloves. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze burning through the window. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first instinct was to lock the door, even though I knew it was already shut. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, shaky and forced. I was letting my imagination get to me, the isolation, the snowstorm. It was messing with my head. I turned my phone on knowing I wouldn't have service this deep in the mountains, but I needed to hear something, anything to break the silence pressing in around me. The screen flickered, the battery icon flashing empty. I had charged it before I left. Outside, the man in the snow hadn't moved. I yanked the curtains closed. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe when I looked again, he would be gone. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't happen. I spent the next hour pacing the small cabin, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind howled, rattling the windows, the wooden walls groaning under its force. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. But then I heard it. A single deliberate knock on the door. My blood ran cold. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, louder this time. Who the hell would be out here in this storm? Slowly I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The cabin was silent now, the wind momentarily dying down. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to work. Hello? No response. The doorknob rattled. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The door was locked. I had checked it twice. My mind raced, trying to make sense of this. Maybe he was lost, stranded in the storm, looking for shelter. But something deep inside me screamed not to open the door. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I stood there, waiting. my body coiled tight with fear. Minutes passed. I reached for my phone again, my fingers fumbling, but the screen remained dark. I forced myself to take a deep breath and move toward the window, just a quick peek, just to be sure he was gone. I pulled the curtain aside. He was right there, not at the edge of the forest anymore, not even on the porch. He was inches from the glass, staring in. I didn't scream. The sound got stuck in my throat, choked off by pure terror. His face was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones, his eyes black pits that swallowed the dim light. His lips barely moved, parting just enough for a whisper to escape. "You let me in before." My entire body went cold. I stumbled back, yanking the curtain shut, my breathing ragged. What the hell did that mean? I had never been here before. I didn't know him. I staggered to the door, pressed my back against it, squeezing my eyes shut. The wind howled again, shrieking through the trees, like a warning. I tried to calm myself, to think. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I was losing my mind out here, alone in the storm. Then I heard the floorboards creak. Inside the cabin, my eyes snapped open. The door was still locked. The windows were shut. But I wasn't alone anymore. I turned slowly, my breath shuddering in my lungs. The fire in the hearth had dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. And in the far corner of the room, where the light barely reached, he stood. Not outside, not knocking. Inside. The exact same man, the hollow face, the dark, empty eyes, standing motionless, his head tilted slightly as if waiting for me to understand. "You let me in before," he whispered again. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The storm outside screamed, the wind shaking the walls, but inside everything was suffocatingly still. And then I remembered. A dream. Or maybe something worse. The night before, I had woken to knocking. Soft, persistent. I had stumbled half asleep to the door, the fire still burning low. In that hazy state, my hand had touched the doorknob, felt the cold metal beneath my palm. I had opened the door, but that wasn't possible. The storm would have woken me fully. The cold would have been unbearable. It had to have been a dream. Except it wasn't, because he was here now. He took a slow step forward. The fire flickered lower. The room grew darker. I ran. I don't remember how I made it to the door, how I managed to rip it open and throw myself into the storm. The wind hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran through the knee-deep snow, my lungs burning, my hands numb, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached my car, my body was shaking so hard I could barely get the door open. My fingers fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires spinning against the ice before finally gripping the road. The cabin disappeared into the storm behind me. I drove for miles before I reached the nearest town. My hands were still trembling when I stumbled into the gas station, desperate for warmth, for people, for anything that felt real. I asked the cashier about the cabin, told her I had rented it for the week. She gave me a strange look. "There's no cabin up there," she said. "Burned down years ago. Some guy got lost in a storm, froze to death. Locals say he still wanders the woods, looking for shelter." I stared at her, my blood turning to ice all over again. Behind me, the automatic doors slid open. A gust of cold air rushed in, and then I heard it, the whisper. "You let me in before." Story number 7, the room that didn't exist. When I booked the cabin, the listing was clear. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, a cozy retreat, for a quiet winter escape. That was what I expected. That was what I saw when I arrived. But the second night, I noticed the door. It was in the hallway, across from the bedroom, slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness stretched into the warm glow of the fireplace. My stomach twisted. That door wasn't there yesterday. I stood frozen, listening. The wind howled outside, rattling against the windows. The snowstorm had buried the roads, making it impossible to leave until morning. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I had just missed it before. Maybe the lighting made it seem like a shadow. I forced myself to move closer. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, cold against my skin. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, but I pushed the door open anyway. The room was identical to mine. Same bed, same wooded furniture, a fireplace burning low, its embers casting flickering light against the walls. But the worst part, the part that made my skin prickle with something far colder than the winter air, was my bag was sitting on the floor, open. Just like in my actual bedroom, my heart slammed against my ribs. This wasn't just a similar room, this was my room. I stepped inside, hesitant, my breath coming fast and uneven. The air smelled the same. Wood smoke, aged pine, and something else, something off. A whisper of movement flickered at the corner of my eye. I turned, sharply. The mirror above the dresser reflected the room perfectly, but I wasn't in it. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering. My reflection was missing. I could see the bed, the flickering fire, the half-open bag, but I wasn't there. The moment I blinked, the door slammed shut behind me. I lunged for twisting the knob, but it wouldn't budge. My breaths came in sharp gasps, the walls seeming to press closer around me. The fire crackled softly, casting strange, shifting shadows along the wooden beams, and then behind me, the floor creaked. I turned, slowly. Someone was sitting on the bed. No, not someone. My own face stared back at me, blank and expressionless. My double tilted its head, studying me the same way I was studying it. Then, slowly, it smiled. A deep, twisting terror rooted me in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. Then, in a voice that sounded just like mine, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come in here." My breath hitched. The air in the room thickened, growing unbearably heavy. The flames in the fireplace flickered wildly, stretching unnaturally tall. I gritted my teeth, forcing my body to move. My hands clawed at the door, nails scraping against the wood. The room spun, dark spots dancing at the edges of my vision. The voice behind me was closer now. You always do this." My stomach lurched. The words didn't make sense, but somehow they felt right, like I had been here before. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse. My reflection still sat on the bed, but something had changed. Its smile was gone. It was standing now, closer. This time, stay. The fire roared, filling the room with blinding light. My ears rang, my vision blurred, my hands scrabbled against the door, desperate nails splintering against the wood. And then suddenly, it opened. I stumbled out, gasping. The hallway was dark, the cabin eerily silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I spun around, expecting the door to still be there, but the wall was blank. Smooth wooden panels, completely solid. No door, no room. I staggered back, my mind racing. I turned, practically ran to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My bag was still there, exactly where I had left it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the spot where the door should have been, my mind looping over the same thought. If that wasn't my reflection in the mirror, then where was I? By the time morning came, I was ready to leave. I packed my bag, moving quickly, ignoring the creeping sensation that something was watching me. I stepped outside, the snow blindingly bright under the morning sun. The car was half buried, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As I reached for the car door, something made me pause. A second set of footprints in the snow. Story number 8. The Airbnb that only shows up in winter. I should have known something was wrong when the gas station clerk went pale at the mention of the Airbnb. I had stopped for supplies, chatting casually with the old woman behind the counter. When she asked where I was staying, I told her the name of the cabin. She froze, her weathered hands tightening around the register. "That place," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't exist." I frowned, pulling up the listing on my phone. The pictures were right there. A charming cabin nestled in the snowy woods, exactly where my GPS had taken me. I showed it to her, forcing a laugh. "I just checked in an hour ago," I said. "It's definitely real." She didn't look at the screen. Her eyes remained fixed on me, dark, with something unreadable. "It only comes back in winter," she said. "And no one who stays ever talks about it again." A shiver ran through me, but I brushed it off. "Just small-town superstition," I told myself. "An old legend meant to scare outsiders." I paid for my groceries, thanked her, and headed back to the cabin. The drive was short, the snow thickening as I climbed higher into the mountains. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it had in the pictures. A cozy, one-bedroom retreat with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the frozen lake. But now, standing in the quiet, her words echoed in my mind. "It only comes back in winter." I shook off the unease and stepped inside. The warmth from the fireplace wrapped around me immediately, though I hadn't started a fire yet. My bag sat untouched by the door. The air smelled of pine and something faintly metallic. I settled in, pushing the gas station conversation to the back of my mind. The storm outside had picked up, wind howling through the trees, thick snow piling against the windows. I wrapped myself in a blanket and made tea, letting the heat soothe the lingering tension in my chest. That night I woke to a sound, not the wind, not the crackling fire, something else, a rhythmic tapping. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming from the window beside the bed, slow, deliberate taps against the glass. I turned my head, pulse hammering. There was nothing outside, just endless white, the snow reflecting the dim moonlight. The trees stood motionless in the distance, their skeletal branches weighed down by frost. Then the tapping came again, louder. But there was nothing there. I forced myself to move, inching toward the window. The cold seeped through the glass, making my fingers ache as I reached up to wipe away the condensation. My breath fogged against it as I peered outside. My stomach dropped. Footprints, a single set, deep in the snow, leading from the woods, stopping right beneath the window. But there were no prints leading away. A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin, making the wooden walls groan. I jerked back, my pulse racing. The fireplace flickered, casting strange shadows against the walls. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in bed, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Morning came slow, the pale light filtering through the thick snowfall. I rushed outside, determined to prove to myself that the footprints had just been some trick of the light. They were still there, clear, unmistakable, and still no prints leading away. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe the snow had covered them. Maybe the wind had erased them overnight. I decided to leave. Grabbing my bag, I checked my phone, ready to pull up the route back to town. But when I opened the Airbnb app, my stomach turned. The listing was gone. Not unavailable. Gone. No record of my booking. No messages from the host. As if the cabin had never existed at all. I scrambled to call someone. Anyone. But my phone showed no service. Panic clawed at my throat. I needed to go. Now. I threw open the front door, ready to run straight to my car. But the driveway was gone. The snow stretched out in every direction, untouched, undisturbed. My car was missing, like it had never been there. The wind howled, kicking up a flurry of ice. I staggered back inside, slamming the door shut, my mind spinning. This wasn't possible. I had parked right outside. I had driven here. My breathing turned shallow as I stumbled back toward the window. The footprints were still there, but now there were more of them. A second set, leading back into the cabin. The floor creaked behind me. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but there was nowhere to go. The fireplace flickered weakly, casting just enough light to see the shape standing in the doorway. It was me, not a reflection, not a trick of the light. Mister wearing the same clothes, the same face, but its eyes were all wrong. Empty, black. Hollow pits where they should have been. It smiled. You came back. I couldn't move. The air was heavy, suffocating, pressing against my chest like a weight. The other me took a step forward. I stumbled back, my vision blurring, the world tilting sideways. The room was spinning, the walls closing in. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was standing outside. The cabin was gone. The snow was untouched, smooth as glass. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been here. My bag was still slung over my shoulder, my fingers frozen from the cold. I turned in frantic circles, scanning the landscape. The road had reappeared. My car was right where I had parked it, like nothing had ever happened. I didn't question it. I ran to my car, threw open the door, and sped down the road without looking back. By the time I reached town, the gas station clerk was outside, shoveling snow. Her eyes widened when she saw me. You were at that cabin, weren't you? She whispered. I could barely nod. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You're lucky, she muttered. Most people don't make it back. I stared at her, my throat dry, my hands still shaking. What is that place? Her expression darkened. No one knows, but every winter it shows up, and every winter someone checks in. I swallowed hard. And what happens to them? She didn't answer. She just pointed to my rearview mirror. I turned slowly, and for just a second, I saw my own reflection in the glass, grinning. Then it blinked, and I didn't. Story number 9. The Whispering Walls. The first whisper came from inside the walls. I had just arrived at the Airbnb, exhausted from the long drive through the snowstorm. The cabin was exactly what I had expected. Small, secluded, nestled deep in the woods, where the only sound was the wind rattling through the trees. The kind of place where silence stretched on for miles. But silence is never really empty. I was unpacking my bag when I heard it. A faint, muffled voice. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks. But then it came again. A whisper. Software urgent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The walls were old, thick wooden logs stacked tightly together. There was no way sound could travel through them like that. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I shook it off. convincing myself I was just tired. The drive had worn me out, and the storm outside had been relentless. I needed rest. I locked the door, built a fire in the hearth, and settled in for the night. But the whispers didn't stop. I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. to a voice hissing through the room. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the walls. I sat up, my skin crawling, my breath coming fast. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows against the wooden beams. The whispering was clearer now. Not words, just the sound of breath, of voices too faint to understand. Not one, many. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black, dead. Even though I had charged it before bed, my pulse pounded as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards cold against my feet. Then, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to get out. But just as my fingers brushed the doorknob, I heard it again. This time, it was right behind me. "Don't turn around." Ice filled my veins. The voice was clearer now, no longer trapped in the walls. It was right there, close enough that I should have felt breath against my neck. I clenched my teeth, squeezing my eyes shut. This wasn't real. I was just hearing things. The isolation was playing tricks on me. Then the whisper came again. "We see you." The air turned thick, heavy, pressing against my skin. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but no one was there. The room was empty. The walls stood solid, unmoving, untouched, but the feeling lingered. That heavy, suffocating weight of being watched. I needed to leave. I grabbed my bag, my fingers shaking as I yanked the zipper open. My keys were inside. I just had to get to the car. I turned toward the door and saw something that made my stomach drop. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the wooden walls, smudged into the dust. Some small, some impossibly large, all of them stretching outward, reaching. I stumbled back, my body colliding with the dresser. The whispers returned, rising all around me, urgent, desperate. "Let us out." The walls groaned, the wooden planks shifting, expanding as if something inside them was pressing outward. I felt a chill seep through the room, colder than the winter air outside. And then, slowly, the handprints started to move, fingers curling, shifting, dragging across the surface of the wood. A low creaking filled the cabin, the sound of something waking up. I bolted for the door, yanking it open, nearly slipping on the ice as I stumbled outside. Snow had piled up against the porch, the storm still raging. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted toward my car. Then I heard it, a whisper, threading through the wind. "You can't leave." The engine roared to life, tires spinning against the frozen ground. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, the headlights cutting through the swirling snow. I didn't dare look back. I drove for what felt like hours, the winding roads slick with ice. My phone finally flickered back to life as I neared town, the signal weak but holding. My hands were still shaking as I pulled into the gas station, desperate to see another person, to ground myself in something real. The cashier, an older man with tired eyes, glanced up as I walked in. He took one look at me and frowned. "Something wrong?" he asked. I hesitated. My mouth was dry, my throat raw. Finally, I forced the words out. "The Airbnb, the one up in the woods. Do you know anything about it?" His expression darkened. "You stayed there?" I nodded. His gaze flicked to the window, watching the snow drift past. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "That place has been empty for years, burned down a long time ago. The owners never made it out." My breath stalled. That's not possible. I was just there. I booked it online. He shook his head. You might have booked something, but it wasn't that cabin. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. My reflection stared back at me from the gas station window, and for just a second, I saw the handprints behind me, pressed against the glass, moving. Story number 10, the Airbnb with a copy of me. I was halfway through my dinner when I heard footsteps in the kitchen. At first, I thought it was the wind. The storm outside had been relentless, thick sheets of snow swallowing the world beyond the cabin. The place was old, the wooden beams groaning with every gust. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of plates shifting, a drawer sliding open. I set my fork down slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I was alone. I had locked the door. No one else should be here. The kitchen was just beyond the living room, hidden behind a short hallway. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, casting shifting shadows along the walls. I stood carefully, moving toward the sound. My heart pounded with each step. The kitchen was empty. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The counters were bare, save for the coffee mug I had used earlier. The fridge was shut, the cabinets closed. But the silverware drawer was open. I knew I hadn't touched it. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. I forced myself to move, gripping the drawer handle and sliding it shut. The soft click echoed through the quiet cabin. I exhaled, shaking my head. I was just tired, but then I saw the plate, a second dinner plate, set neatly at the table across from mine. There was food on it, the same meal I'd just been eating, the exact portion, the same bite missing. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled as I stepped back, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I had only made one plate. I was sure of it. A soft creak came from the hallway. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering. The cabin had gone impossibly still. The fire flickered, casting long shadows. My breath came in uneven gasps as I slowly stepped toward the hall. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. "You're early." I stopped breathing. The voice was mine. It came from the bedroom. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but my legs refused to move. The silence pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. Then the door creaked open, and I saw myself standing in the doorway. Same clothes, same face, but the thing staring at me wasn't me. Its eyes were too dark, too empty. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, before stepping forward. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. It took another step, its movements too smooth, too calculated. You're not supposed to be here yet," it said. Its voice was calm, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to move, my hand darting for the front door. I didn't care about my bag, my phone. I just needed to get out, but the door wouldn't open. The lock twisted under my grip, the handle refusing to budge. The air turned thick, suffocating. My breaths came fast and uneven. Behind me, the thing pretending to be me let out a soft sigh. "You always make this difficult." I turned, pressing my back against the door. It stood just a few feet away now, watching me. Its smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp. I clenched my fist. "Who are you?" The smile widened. "You." The fire in the hearth sputtered, dimming. The shadows stretched along the walls, twisting unnaturally. My reflection, no, the thing wearing my face, tilted its head again. "You should have waited," it said softly. "Now, I have to fix this. It lunged. I barely had time to react. I dove to the side, crashing into the table, sending my plate shattering to the floor. My head slammed against the wood, pain exploding behind my eyes. When I looked up, the thing was gone. The room was empty. The only sound was my ragged breathing. The fire had nearly died out, casting the cabin in deep flickering shadows. Then I heard the whisper, "Next time, don't be early." The room spun. My vision blurred. A heavy exhaustion settled over me, my body growing weaker with every passing second. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting at the dining table. My plate was whole. The fire burned strong in the hearth. My untouched meal sat in front of me, still warm. The cabin was exactly as it had been when I arrived. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the table. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it? Had I fallen asleep? I turned slowly toward the bedroom. The door was shut. I stood on unsteady legs, my breath shallow. I needed to leave. Now I reached for my phone, fully charged, sitting exactly where I had left it. I rushed to the front door, yanking it open. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. My car sat untouched in the driveway, its windshield clear. Everything looked normal. But as I stepped onto the porch, something caught my eye. Footprints, a single set, leading from the front door into the woods. Not mine. I didn't look back. I didn't question it. I got in my car and drove. The next day, I checked the Airbnb listing. It was gone. No record of my reservation. No host. No address. Like the place had never existed. I told myself it was over. But then last night I heard something. A soft creak in my apartment. And a whisper, close enough to feel the breath against my ear. Next time, don't be late. Story number 11. The host who wasn't alive. The first time I spoke to my Airbnb host, she seemed perfectly normal. Her name was Margaret. Her messages were polite, short, and to the point. She gave me check-in instructions, told me where to find the key, and even left a welcome note on the kitchen counter when I arrived. The cabin was cozy, just as described, tucked away in the snowy woods, isolated, quiet, exactly what I needed. Everything felt fine until the second night. I was reading by the fire when my phone buzzed. A new message from Margaret. "How's the stay so far? Let me know if you need anything." I smiled, typing out a quick reply. "Everything is great, thanks." The message sent. I turned back to my book, but something felt off. I glanced at the time, 3:12 a.m. Why would she message me in the middle of the night? A slow unease crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. Maybe she was in a different time zone. Maybe she was just being a good host. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the doors, made sure the windows were shut, and tried to sleep. That was the first mistake. The next morning I woke to find, the front door wide open. Cold air rushed through the cabin. Snow piled in the doorway. My stomach twisted. I knew I had locked it. I had checked twice. A creeping sense of dread settled in my gut. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I was just tired from the long drive. I checked my phone. Another message from Margaret. "Glad you're enjoying your stay. If you need extra blankets, there are some in the closet by the bedroom." I swallowed hard. I hadn't told her I was cold. I hadn't told her anything. I typed out a response. "Did you come by the cabin last night?" The reply came instantly. "Nope, just checking in." I stared at the message, my pulse hammering. Something about the smiley face made my skin crawl. That night, I triple-checked the locks. I pushed a chair against the front door, wedged a heavy suitcase against the back door. The storm outside had grown worse, the wind howling through the trees like something alive. Sometime in the night, I woke to a sound, a soft creaking. At first, I thought it was the wind shifting the old wood, but then I heard it again, closer this time, inside. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then, from the darkness, my phone buzzed. A message. "Why did you lock the door?" My blood ran cold. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I forced myself to type. "I just like to be safe." 3 dots appeared. Then another message. "No need to worry. It's just us here." I dropped the phone, my stomach twisted violently. Us? I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a fire poker, my fingers tightening around the cold metal. I wasn't alone. The floor creaked behind me. I spun, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty, but the front door was open again. Wide open. I took a slow, shaking step forward, gripping the poker tight. My footprints were the only ones in the snow. No sign of anyone else. No tracks leading to or from the cabin. Something had been inside. I slammed the door shut, my hands slick with sweat. My phone buzzed again. "Did you like the blankets?" The closet door. I turned, my pulse hammering. It was slightly open now. I was sure it had been shut earlier. I stepped closer, heart pounding. The blankets were inside, neatly folded, but something was wrong. Behind them, in the dim light, I saw a hand, pale, motionless, pressed against the back wall. I staggered back, a choked gasp escaping my throat. My fingers fumbled for my phone, shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I needed to call someone, the police, anyone. I tried to dial, but the screen froze. The battery icon flashed red, even though it had been at 80% minutes ago. A new message appeared. "You're not supposed to look in there." The air turned ice cold. My breath came in ragged gasps. Then, for the first time, I noticed something else. The welcome note on the kitchen counter. I hadn't read it before, just glanced at it. But now, my eyes locked onto the handwriting. It wasn't neat. It wasn't polite. It was frantic, jagged. "Get out. She's not real." A low creak echoed behind me. I didn't turn around. I ran. My feet pounded against the wooden floor as I yanked the door open, the freezing wind hitting me like a wall. The snow was deep, but I pushed forward, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. I could still hear the phone buzzing behind me, messages coming in one after another. I didn't look. I didn't stop. I made it to my car, my frozen hands fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. As I sped down the icy road, I risked one final glance in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent against the snow, but in the window, watching me leave, was Margaret. She was smiling. And then she vanished. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. I stumbled into the nearest gas station, gasping for breath. The clerk gave me a strange look as I tried to steady myself. I need help," I stammered. "The Airbnb, the cabin, I think someone was inside, I think..." The clerk's face darkened. He set his hands on the counter, shaking his head slowly. "Son," he said, voice low, "that cabin burned down 5 years ago." I felt the world tilt beneath me. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible. I was just there. I talked to Margaret. She sent me messages. The man's face was unreadable. "Margaret was the owner," he said. "She died in that fire. No one's been up there since." My phone buzzed again. I lifted it with trembling hands. One new message. "Come back soon. If you made it this far, you're a true horror fan." What would you do if you found yourself in one of these terrifying situations? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your own horror experiences. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a chilling tale. More terrifying stories are waiting for you. Click on the videos appearing on your screen now. Stay safe and sleep with the lights on.